Vermicompost is one of the most well-known homemade garden amendments. It's sort of the novice gardener's first step into DIY soil fertility. When we were first experimenting with worms, there were a lot of basic questions that we had. How do we feed them and how often? How do we know when the castings are finished and how do we use them? So in this video, I'd like to answer some of the simple questions that anyone wanting to try vermicomposting might have. And as I go through the questions, I'm going to provide what I consider to be some really straightforward answer to the questions, the simple way, and then I'll also give a few ways that you can upgrade your practice, a slightly advanced level, if you will. So it's worth asking, why have worms at all? And the basic answer to that question is composting worms convert unused resources into fertility, worm castings. They can be added back into your soil. Worms themselves also do incredible work in your soil. And on top of this, worms are remarkably easy to keep alive and are generally low maintenance. Red wigglers are typically used for vermicomposting. These worms are really efficient and can live in the top layers of the soil. These are known as the composting worms. You can buy them online through a local dealer, or better yet, if you have a friend with them already, they will likely very gladly share them with you. All you'll need is a vermicomposting bin like this, or a simple 3-tote or bucket system. And these can be really easily made at home by simply drilling holes into the bottom of 2 totes and then placing a 3rd tote beneath them to catch the worm leachate. If you'd rather put in even less work, many find success in simply separating out the worms from finished castings inside of a single container. We recommend any container that allows for drainage, since you'll want to be able to make sure that the material in the bin doesn't become soggy but stays moist. Under another basic question, what can you feed worms? Well, raw veggie peelings and scraps are a very common food source for worms. We prefer to collect these food scraps over the course of the day in a home compost container and then empty it out into the worm bin at the end of the day. Exceptions include anything from the allium family, like onions, garlics, leeks, etc. However, if you leave onion or garlic skins out to dry until they become brittle, you can add them into your bin in moderation. Raw fruit scraps are also a desirable food source for your worms. However, leave out citrus fruits, as the oils and the peel and the rind are not really good for worms. However, similarly to onion skins, if you can leave orange, lemon, lime peels out to dry for a week or two, then you can add them in moderation. Coffee grounds and tea bags are great for your worm bin. You can get some at your local coffee shop if you don't drink coffee, or if you've got a really large vermicomposting operation. And finally, crushed up dried eggshells can be fed to worms. Just make sure that you're not adding a lot of egg whites and yolks. In fact, as a general principle, we'd suggest that you chop up materials, since it makes it much easier for the worms to ingest and process into castings. An advanced feed option for worms is fully fermented bokashi pre-compost. And this deserves its own video, so I won't be exploring bokashi too much in this one. But briefly, bokashi composting is a means of fermenting food scraps to make them more easily broken down in a compost pile. However, you can also feed your bokashi scraps to your worms, and they thrive with the bokashi culture. A common question is, how often or how much should I feed worms? And the extremely clear and helpful answer for you is not too much and not too little. In all seriousness, you will have to feel out how much your worms can consume and process. However, you can sort of determine the size of your worm population by how much you feed them. If you want to increase your worm population, then simply provide more food and your worms will multiply according to the increased quantity. If you want to decrease the population, then decrease the amount of food that you give them. You may want to remove some of your worms from your bin and incorporate them into your garden so that you don't starve your population. A steady stream every day or every few days seems to be ideal, as worms get the best chance with a consistent stream of food. So another really essential question is how to use the worm castings. And this is a question that often goes unanswered because it's kind of like, well, isn't it obvious? But early on, when I was vermicomposting, I legitimately wondered, okay, so do I just like toss clumps of castings near my plants? And the reality is there are a lot of ways that you can use the castings. The simplest way is just to mix them into the top layers of your garden soil. Another simple way to reap their benefits is to use them in your seed starting potting mix. A little goes a long way here, so start with a cup or two of castings per gallon of potting mix. What other ways can you use worms? Well, one of our favorite ways is to spread a lot of worm castings across a large area by making a slurry from the castings and mixing them in water. Don't just pour this on your plants unless you've significantly diluted it, otherwise you can burn the plant roots. And you can let this sit for up to 24 hours and then just make sure to mix it thoroughly before spreading it over your soil. A similar technique to this involves collecting worm leachate that you can get by straining water through finished castings. This is not worm tea. The technical term for this is leachate, but it is nonetheless a great source of microbes and humic acid, among other nutrients, for your plants. Getting into some of the more advanced uses of worm castings, aerated worm teas can be made to provide a powerful boost of cultivated microbial activity to your soil. You'll need some equipment to do this, specifically a bubbler or some way to aerate the tea, a mesh bag or cheesecloth that will hold the worm castings, sort of a tea bag effect, and of course a vessel like a bucket or a garbage can to hold the water as it's being kept aerated. These worm teas can be aerated for between 24 and 72 hours before being diluted and applied to the soil and foliarly to plants. Another advanced use for worm castings would be charging your biochar with them. Incidentally, you can also charge biochar with worm tea and a carbohydrate, creating a more shelf-stable form of microbial activity. Okay, now that you know some of the ways to use your worm castings, let's talk about the basics of keeping these guys alive. Your worms will need a medium to inhabit, one that is more carbonaceous than nitrogenous. Basically, you don't want it to get slimy. Simple materials that work great are a mix of peat moss or cocoa coir, cardboard shreds, dried brown leaves, small wood chips in moderation, and aged livestock manure. You'll want 2 or more of these mediums. Some slightly more upgraded options would include mature compost mixed with leaf mold, soil, and biochar. In fact, this is the best way, in my opinion, to pair vermicomposting with biochar. Activated charcoal will help keep moisture levels controllable, and it reduces even the very mild odors that worm bins put off. You can also add diluted LAB and JMS to infuse your vermicompost with an even more robust microbiome. I've mentioned moisture levels a few times so far. Basically, you don't want your habitat to be too dry because worms will struggle traveling through it, but you also don't want the material to be too saturated because castings can become anaerobic and run the risk of developing unwanted mold. Microbes can die off in such conditions, and worms won't thrive so much either. Temperature is another factor that can determine the success or failure of your worm bin. Typically, room temperature in your home will be an ideal climate for your worms. If you leave the worms outside in 100 degrees, they're very likely to die or try to escape, speaking from experience. If you leave them outside during the winter, they'll also die from freezing temperatures, also speaking from experience. Worms thrive in temperatures between 50 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. As your worms multiply, similarly to a SCOBY, you may want to divide the population up. We recommend either giving them to a friend or putting them directly into the garden. Hope that some of this was helpful for you in your vermicomposting operations. If it was, would you give our video a like? And also, if you could leave a comment below with any questions that you want or further content on this topic. Also, if you have any suggestions for how to raise worms that you found to be really helpful, please leave that in the comments as well.